the project idea was that I was with a friend and we were going to go traveling, and we wanted to, learn languages. Thought that would be an interesting idea for a project to do. And the sort of method of the project was that when we would land in each country, we wouldn't speak in English to each other or to anyone that we would meet. And there's a bit of a backstory to this of me trying to learn French years before this, and really struggling, even though I had a chance to be in France. And so you'd think, well, if you're living in France, obviously you're going to learn French. And it didn't seem to be working out that well. And that was kind of surprising for me. I think a lot of people would assume, oh, well, if you just go to that country, then you'll just learn it. It'll be easy. And I've actually found that most people don't learn the other language that they're going to live in the country that they're staying in. They don't usually do that unless they stay for a really long time and there's some really strong pressure for them to do it. But I mean, I've met people who, like, especially in Asian countries, that have lived there for decades and they can't speak barely more than a few sentences of the native language that is there. So whether that's Korea or China or Japan or something similar. And so I think it's clearly the case that learning languages is hard. I don't think I need to, say that. Most people, I think, find it hard. Most people can remember taking, years of high school French or Spanish or German classes and don't feel like they're fluent in the language. But I think it's even more so than that, that often, even when you're in the best circumstance, you're not just taking a class in college and you don't really care about it that much, but you're really trying to do it. It's your number one goal. You're living in the country. Even then, many, many people fail. And one of the observations I had from that experience in France was that one of the big problems of this is not really an intellectual problem. It's not really how do you memorize all the vocabulary, learn grammar, these kind of things? Because those things are issues. I don't want to say that they are part of what makes learning a language hard, but they're not the central issue. I think the central issue is that we often don't really need to use a language to communicate. So we're not being forced to use it. We're learning it purely as this academic exercise. And because it's just this academic exercise, not only do we not have as much motivation to really, like, what is the right word to say this matters a lot more when you need it to get something done versus when it's just, for a test later. But also this fact that you don't need it to communicate means that it tends to occupy a lot less of your time. Even if you're a very dedicated student, maybe you're studying 3-4 hours a day, that's like as a part-time job. That's a lot for most people, but yet that's far less than the total amount of time that you're speaking and listening to people throughout the day in your native language. So my observation of this is that one of the challenges of someone who is not fluent, or at least not proficient at all in a language when they want to go to a place where they want to do some immersion or they want to learn the language, is that they say to themselves, well, you know what, I'm going to first try to get a grasp of it, just get settled, and then maybe a little later I'll really start to kind of practice and learn and do this kind of thing. And the problem is that when you get to a country, so to take France, for instance, when I went there, I didn't speak French. And so who do you make friends with? Well, you make friends with people who speak English, either other expats or other French people who have a command of the English language, and you get used to speaking them in English. Now this becomes a real barrier, because if you want to actually start practicing, you have to go from the language you're fluent in and everyone's used to you being very proficient in, to a language that you can barely speak at all. And this real strong communicative gap creates strong social pressures to keep you inside that bubble. And I think that bubble, it's kind of an irony, because you can even be in places where there are virtually no speakers who share the native language with you and still be very pressed inside that bubble. I remember I was in Kunming, China, which is a smaller city, well, 10 million people or so, but it's a smaller city in Chinese terms in China, sort of north of Vietnam. And there's not a lot of Westerners there. There's, it's mostly Chinese people. And yet I would meet people who've lived there for 7-8 years and they can't speak Chinese. And it's sort of like, how do you even function here? Because there's only, there's probably less than 200 people that you could even possibly communicate with in a sort of native language to native language sense. And so this is a really strong problem. And so I just say this backstory because there's a motivation for wanting to do something so extreme. But the idea was, well, what if you didn't have that problem? What if you went to the country and from the first day you only spoke the language you were trying to learn, even though you can't really speak it very well, even though you're just using Google Translate, even though you're just using a dictionary. And so this was sort of the kind of hypothesis, I guess you could say, that that Vat and I had before we started our project, that this would work, that if you did this, you would be able to learn the language more quickly. And I would say that in Spain, it worked incredibly well. We went there, we had done a little bit of practice beforehand, so I don't suggest doing it with zero practice, but we stuck with it. And what happened is, well, first of all, we spoke to each other all the time in Spanish. So even though our Spanish was rudimentary, we're still practicing the basic, hola, ¿cómo estás? ¿Dónde está el baño? These kind of like basic phrases. But then anyone you meet also learns to kind of deal with you in that language. And I think what happens a lot of times is if people only know you through the kind of less proficient language, there isn't as much social friction. I mean, sometimes people, I don't want to talk to that guy because he can't really communicate very well, but that actually happens a lot less than you'd think. Whereas if you go from being really fluent to struggling through conversations, people suddenly lose patience because it's the transition between those that's really difficult. And so we were there for 3 months. And I would say, fluency is a really difficult thing to gauge. I think some people have standards where it means it's identical to your native language, even though very, very few people are actually that level in practice. Whereas other people say, well, if you can get through a conversation like this and then you miss a few words, then it's also okay. But I would say that we were able to get to a level where the functioning of day-to-day life, of having friends, going on dates, seeing movies, doing all these kinds of things, was smooth enough that it was not a problem for us to do things. And so we could really live in Spanish life and do sorts of things that would really be impossible if we didn't have that proficiency. And so this was actually the first leg of a bigger trip. So we went to Spain and we did that. And then we went to Brazil and did it again. And then we went to China. I mentioned Kunming. I went to China. And then finally we went to Korea. And while it is harder with Asian languages, they are more work to learn, the principle remains the same. And so I think, maybe even if you're not interested in learning a language, this story doesn't have that much relevance to you if you're, well, I don't want to go to another country and immerse myself 100%. I think this fundamental principle about learning, that there are often barriers that aren't really about you not being smart enough, but about the environment, about the way you've set up your project and your challenge, that prevent you from really achieving the outcome you want, whether that's, to get a skill for a new job or learn a new hobby or even learn a subject like philosophy. I think it's really important.